The New York subway is a great equalizer. It doesn't care if you're in a designer suit or shoes with worn-out soles. It just shoves you all together in a rattling metal tube and sends you screaming through the dark. For me, it was a daily reminder of my place in the city's food chain, somewhere near the bottom. The screech of the train wheels was the soundtrack to my life, a constant, grating noise that mirrored the anxiety humming just beneath my skin. My existence was a simple, brutal equation. Hours worked at the laundromat minus the cost of my shoebox apartment, and instant noodles equaled just enough to do it all over again the next day. It was on that C train, rattling its way downtown, that I first saw her. Or, more accurately, when I first noticed her watching me. You learn, living the way I do, to be an observer. You watch people's hands, their eyes, the way they shift their weight. It's about survival. And my survival instincts were screaming that this woman was trouble. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, all sharp angles and chaotic energy. Her dark hair was shaved on one side, the other half falling over an eye that seemed to see right through the grimy train car and into the rattling mess of my own thoughts. But it was the ink that made me nervous. A cascade of black and gray tattoos snaked up her neck from the collar of her worn leather jacket, disappearing into her hairline. More ink covered the backs of her hands, intricate patterns that wrapped around fingers adorned with heavy silver rings. She looked like she'd chew up girls like me and spit out the bones. And she was always staring. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, a trick of the light, my own paranoia. But every morning, at the 125th Street station, she'd get on and find a spot across the car, and her eyes would lock onto mine. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a focused, unblinking study, as if she were committing my worn-out coat and perpetually tired face to memory. My heart would start thumping a frantic, trapped rhythm against my ribs. I'd stare at my reflection in the dark window, at the floor, at the peeling advertisements, anywhere but at her. To meet that gaze felt like accepting a challenge I was certain to lose. That Tuesday was worse than most. The first of the month, rent day. The envelope with Mr. Henderson's cash, $450, a sum that felt like $1 million, was a lead weight in my coat pocket. All morning, my hand kept straying to it, a nervous tick, just to feel the crisp edges of the bills through the thin fabric. It was my shield against the street, the only thing standing between my tiny room and nothing. I don't like to think about the nothing. The laundromat hung thick with the steam of bleach, carrying the faint traces of other people's daily lives. I folded towels, sorted socks, and fed quarters into hungry machines, my mind drifting 1,000,000 miles away, replaying the count of that money over and over, even though I'd already tallied it a dozen times. Mrs. Gable from 3B complained about a lost sock, and I just nodded, her voice a dull buzz against the roar in my ears. It was only when I was locking up for the night, sky outside a bruised purple, that I reached into my pocket for my keys and found only lint. A cold wave washed over me. I patted my other pocket. Nothing. My jeans. Nothing. The practiced calm I wore like a second skin began to crack. I dumped my bag's meager contents onto the folding table, a half-eaten granola bar, a well-worn library book, loose change. No wallet. No rent envelope. Panic coiled around my throat, tight and cold. Without that money, I'd be on the street by week's end. No roof, no safety, just the harsh concrete of the city. I raked my hands through my hair, knocking over a pile of folded sheets, and stared at the empty space where my wallet should have been, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The laundromat, usually a warm, humming cocoon, suddenly felt vast and cold. My mind raced backward, stumbling through the day. The crowded train that morning, jostling bodies, and a pair of dark, watchful eyes. The image surfaced, sharp and unwelcome, the girl with the tattoos, the way she never looked away. My stomach clenched into a cold, hard knot. It wasn't just a random pickpocket. It felt personal, like a predator singling out the weakest member of the herd. Desperation is a powerful fuel. It burns through fear, through reason, through the quiet, sensible voice in your head that tells you to just give up. I didn't go home. I couldn't. There was no home to go to without that envelope. Instead, I walked back to the subway station, steps mechanical, mind a frantic buzz of impossible plans. I knew her routine. She was often at the station in the evenings, leaning against the same tiled pillar, just watching the world go by. And sure enough, there she was, a study in stillness, a stark silhouette against the river of commuters. The sight of her, so calm and unaffected, sent a surge of hot, helpless anger through me. It took every ounce of courage I had to walk over. My legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. I practiced the words in my head, but they dissolved into a useless jumble on my tongue. I stopped a few feet away, and only then did she seem to notice me, her head tilting with a flicker of, was that recognition? Her gaze was just as intense up close. Her eyes weren't black, as I'd thought, but a deep, stormy gray, fringed with thick lashes. A small silver ring pierced her nostril. My voice was a pathetic squeak. I cleared my throat and tried again, forcing myself to look at the cracked tile behind her head. I think you have something of mine. A slow smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes, a sharp, knowing expression that made me feel like an insect under a microscope. Do I? Her voice was lower than I expected, a smoky alto. My wallet, I managed, words tumbling out in a rush. And an envelope, money for my rent. I need it back. Please. I was begging. I hated the sound of it, the weakness in every syllable. She didn't deny it. She didn't move. She just watched me, that unnerving smile still in place. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the roar of an approaching train. I could feel tears pricking at my eyes, hot and shameful. I had made a terrible mistake. Just as I was about to turn and flee, she pushed herself off the pillar. She was taller than me, and for a second, I thought she was going to grab me. I flinched, bracing for impact. Instead, she looked me up and down, a thoughtful, almost clinical assessment. Where'd you last have it? Her tone shifted from amusement to something more like business. I blinked, confused. Or in my coat pocket. This morning. On the train. She nodded, a short, sharp movement. And where'd you get off? Canal Street, I mumbled. Let's go. It wasn't a suggestion. She started toward the turnstiles, and I followed, no other choice like being caught in a current too weak to fight. We rode downtown in silence. She stood, holding a pole, gaze fixed on the tunnel's passing darkness. I sat, hands clenched in my lap, mind a total blank. When we reached Canal, she led the way with strange certainty, past fruit stands stacked with oranges, past the newsstand where I sometimes bought coffee. And there, wedged in the metal slot of the newspaper vending machine, was a flash of brown leather. My wallet. I lunged for it, hands shaking as I pulled it free. The rent envelope was still inside, cash untouched. Relief crashed over me so hard I felt dizzy. I sank onto a nearby bench, clutching it to my chest like a holy relic. She stood over me, arms crossed, that unreadable look still on her face. You drop things, she said, voice flat. You should be more careful. It wasn't a taunt, just a fact. And in that moment, shame burned deep. I hadn't just been wrong. I'd been spectacularly, humiliatingly wrong. I'd seen a monster, but she'd shown me something else. Not cruelty. Not greed. Just something I couldn't name. Thank you. The words felt small, inadequate against the tidal wave of relief and shame inside me. I looked up at her, really looked, no fear clouding my view. The hard lines of her face were still there, but I noticed new things. Weariness around her eyes, tension in her jaw. She was just as tired as I was in her own way. Don't mention it, she said, turning to leave. Wait. The word burst out, louder than I intended. Let me buy you dinner. Or something. To thank you. She stopped and looked back, one eyebrow raised in pure skepticism. You sure you can afford that? You were about to be homeless 5 minutes ago. Blunt, but not cruel. Heat crept up my neck. I can afford dinner, I said, voice steadier than I felt. Please. She studied me for a long moment, gray eyes seeming to weigh every fear I had. Finally, she shrugged.
Fine.
But none of that fancy stuff. I know a place. The place was a tiny 24-hour diner tucked away on a side street, thick with the smell of grease and burnt coffee. It was perfect, exactly my speed. We slid into a cracked vinyl booth under flickering fluorescent lights. The silence was awkward, filled with kitchen clatter. I stared at the menu like it held answers. "The name's Piper," she said, breaking the quiet. "Ruby," I replied, still glued to the omelet list. "So, Ruby," she said, leaning forward on her elbows. Her silver rings clicked against the Formica tabletop. "You always accuse total strangers of robbing you, or was I just special?" Teasing. My face flushed. "I'm sorry," I mumbled to the menu. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. "I get it," she said, voice surprisingly gentle. "This city's got a way of making you think the worst of people." She picked up a sugar packet, twisting it between her tattooed fingers. "But sometimes you get it wrong." The waitress arrived then, saving me from responding. We ordered, and as we ate, a fragile truce settled. Piper didn't press for details about my life, and I was too nervous to ask about hers. But I watched her, how she salted her fries with careful precision, how her eyes crinkled when she smiled at the waitress. The person I'd imagined and the one sitting across from me were nothing alike. After that night, something shifted. The subway no longer felt hostile. Piper was still there each morning, her gaze still finding mine, but the fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, humming curiosity. She'd give a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I'd nod back. A silent conversation, an acknowledgement of the odd thread connecting us. Then she started appearing outside the train. One afternoon, as I swept the laundromat sidewalk, I saw her leaning against the lamppost across the street, smoking and watching traffic. Seeing her outside our subway routine felt jarring. When she noticed me looking, she gave a two-fingered salute and vanished around the corner. A few days later, I was fighting with a stubborn washing machine when the door's bell jingled. It was Piper, holding two steaming paper cups. She handed one to me, black coffee, just how I liked it. I had no idea how she knew. "Machine's busted?" she asked, nodding at the silent appliance. "The agitator's stuck," I sighed, brushing lint from my forehead. Before I could stop her, she set her coffee down and crouched beside it, peering inside. Her fingers moved deftly, prodding the mechanism. There was a loud click, and the machine whirred to life. She stood, wiping her hands on her jeans.
"There.
Easy." She started stopping by regularly after that. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes she sat on a folding table, sketching in a worn notebook while I worked. Her presence began to feel normal, a fixed point in my chaotic weeks. And with that normalcy came a new feeling. When she brushed past me in narrow aisles, her arm grazing mine, or tapped my shoulder to make a point, my heart would race, not from fear, but from a new, unfamiliar urge to stay close. I never pulled away. I just stood there, caught between my lifelong instinct to retreat and a quiet want to let her in. Late summer's humidity smothered the city. The laundromat's air was worse, thick with steam and detergent that clung to skin. I was at the end of a long shift, body aching, when Piper appeared in the doorway. She said nothing, just watched as I hauled a heavy canvas cart of wet towels toward the dryers. The cart's wheel caught on a linoleum crack, and it tilted precariously. I grunted, trying to right it, but my sweaty hands slipped. Just as it was about to tip, Piper was there. She grabbed the cart side with one hand, her other resting on my arm to steady me. "Whoa there," she said, voice low. "Let me get that." She righted the cart easily, then loaded the damp towels into the dryer one armful at a time. No protest, no fanfare. I stood frozen, my arm still tingling where her hand had been. It was such a simple act of help, but her touch had been firm, sure, and for a split second, she'd lingered. When she finished, she turned to me, wiping her hands. "You look beat," she said, gray eyes scanning my face. "Long day," I managed, voice distant. She reached out, and for a heartbeat, I thought she'd touch me again. Instead, she tucked a stray strand of damp hair behind my ear. Her fingers brushed my temple, and a jolt went through me. Not surprise, but a quiet question I couldn't voice. Her hand dropped, but her gaze held mine. The laundromat's hum faded. There was only the thick air between us, and the unspoken thing in her eyes. My carefully built walls weren't just cracking, they were starting to crumble. One evening, we sat on my apartment building steps, sharing a carton of takeout noodles. The air had cooled, and streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. Piper was quiet, sketching in her notebook, pencil scratch a steady rhythm against the city's hum. My eyes kept drifting to her forearm, a tattoo of a ship in a bottle, waves inside wild and turbulent. It looked soft, out of place among her harsher, darker ink. "What's that one for?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Too personal, a step over a line I didn't know existed. Piper stopped sketching. She stared at her arm like she was seeing the tattoo for the first time. I braced for her to shut me down, to say it was none of my business. Instead, she traced the bottle's outline with her finger. "My grandfather," she said, voice soft. "He was a sailor. Told me stories about Atlantic storms that could swallow a ship whole. He'd say the world could be raging, but if you had a strong bottle, you could keep your little piece of the sea safe." She paused, finger resting on the tiny ship. "He built models like this. After he died, I got this so I wouldn't forget, the way he laughed when he spilled rum on his ships, the way he said bravery's just holding on when you want to run." The story was so tender, it took my breath away. I'd thought her tattoos were armor, a show of toughness. Maybe some were. But this was a memorial, a piece of love etched into her skin. "It's beautiful," I said quietly. She looked up, a small, sad smile on her lips. "He thought so." Sitting there on those grimy steps, I saw her. Not the subway stranger, not the washer fixer, just Piper. A person made of memories, of loss, of love. The ink wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a map, and she'd let me read a small part of it. The city felt a little less scary. My apartment was more closet than home, small, sparse, furnished with cast-offs and thrift store finds. It was my sanctuary, the one place I didn't have to pretend. I rarely let anyone in. But Piper wasn't just anyone. She was there one evening, helping me fix a leaky kitchen faucet. We worked in comfortable silence, the only sounds the wrench's clank and Piper's occasional muttered curse. When we finished, we sat on the kitchen floor, backs against cupboards, tired and smudged with grime. The sun had set. The only light came from a street lamp outside, casting a pale orange glow through the window. The room was full of shadows, and the city's noise faded to a distant murmur. It was intensely quiet. Piper was watching me, same look that had terrified me on the subway, same look that had held a question in the laundromat. But now I could read it. It wasn't just focus. It was vulnerability, raw and unguarded, mirroring my own. It was the look of someone standing on a cliff, wondering if they should jump. My heart slowed to a heavy, steady beat. Every nerve felt alive, hyper-aware of the small space between us. I could smell the wrench's metallic tang on her hands, mixed with her clean, sharp soap. The air grew thick, charged with every unsaid thing from weeks of shared glances and coffees. It felt like the moment before a summer storm, when the world holds its breath, waiting for rain. I didn't know what was coming, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was just waiting. The silence wasn't empty. It hummed with the refrigerator's low drone, a distant siren, the quiet thud of my heart. Piper's gaze never left my face, and I couldn't look away. It felt like the end of a long journey. Every subway nod, every coffee, every small act of help leading to this, sitting on a worn linoleum floor, almost dark, inches apart. Slowly, as if moving through water, she leaned forward. No rush, no sudden move, just a gentle closing of the gap. I saw her eyes flutter shut just before mine did. Her lips were warm, a soft pressure that felt like a question, not a demand. It was brief, simple, over almost as soon as it began. No fireworks, no grand revelations. Just stillness, a calm that settled over the chaotic parts of my mind. I didn't pull back. I didn't flinch. I just stayed, letting the moment sink in. For someone who'd spent a lifetime building walls, this stillness was a revolution. A surrender, not to her, but to the possibility of something better than fear. When she pulled back, the air between us felt different. Still charged, but the tension had softened into something fragile, something hopeful. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. A door I didn't know existed had unlocked. The next morning felt like waking in a new world. The light through my window was less gray. The street noise less harsh. Nothing had changed. Rent was still due next month. My job was still monotonous, but how I saw it had shifted. Piper was waiting at the subway station, same as always. But when our eyes met, a quiet understanding passed between us. The tease in her gaze was softer now, underlined by something warmer. Our interactions felt different, too. When she handed me coffee, her fingers brushed mine, and a pleasant warmth spread up my arm. Not anxiety. When she sketched in the laundromat, I found myself watching her brow furrow in concentration, her lower lip caught between her teeth, and felt a fondness that was new and overwhelming. The change was in me, most of all. I walked with my head higher. I stopped seeing every stranger as a threat. The low hum of fear that had haunted me for years faded, replaced by a quiet, cautious hope. Hope was scarier than fear. Fear was familiar, it kept you sharp. Hope made you vulnerable, open to hurts you hadn't imagined. Every time Piper smiled, every time she sought me out, a part of me braced for disappointment. But another part, newer, braver, dared to believe it might not come. We spent the next weeks learning each other, slow and careful. I learned Piper's favorite color was the deep blue of twilight. She learned I loved old black and white movies, the ones where the dialogue was sharp and the endings were soft. We mapped each other's lives, her tough shell protecting a loyal, gentle heart, my silence hiding a hunger for connection. She never pushed me to talk about my past, accepting that my trust grew slow. I never pressed her about the other tattoos, or where she went when she wasn't with me. We took it one day at a time. Our connection deepened in quiet moments, sharing a meal without filling the silence, walking through the city at night, her shoulder brushing mine as we dodged crowds. The unspoken became our language. One evening, we climbed to the roof of her apartment building, looking out at the city's glittering skyline. The wind was cool, tangling my hair. Piper reached over, tucking the strands behind my ear, her fingers lingering on my cheek. This time, when she leaned in, it wasn't a surprise. It was inevitable, a natural end to the conversation we'd been having for weeks. Her lips were softer than I remembered, the touch holding weight, depth. It was a promise, quiet and sure, high above the city's noise. I didn't hesitate. I leaned in, too, a small shift, a conscious step out of the shadows I'd lived in for so long. Life didn't get easier. The laundromat machines still broke. My paycheck still barely covered expenses. The math of survival was the same. But I wasn't solving it alone. Anxiety still lingered, a faint ghost at the edge of my thoughts, but it didn't paralyze me. Piper was my anchor, knowing she'd be at the subway in the morning, knowing she might show up at the laundromat with coffee, knowing she'd listen when I ranted about broken dryers. It was enough. More than enough. One afternoon, I stood at my apartment window. For years, all I'd seen was the grimy brick wall next door, a symbol of how small my life felt. But that day, I looked up, past the wall, to the sliver of sky between buildings. Pale blue, dotted with wispy clouds. It had always been there. I'd just never looked. My door buzzed sharp, familiar. I smiled. I didn't need to ask who it was. I turned from the window and walked toward the door, steps light, heart steady. The future was still unknown, no guarantees of a happy ending. But for the first time, the unknown didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an open sky.